I thought I knew exactly who I was. For 43 years, I believed my life was built on a foundation that could never be shaken. I believed I knew where I came from, who loved me first, and why every photograph in our family albums told the complete story of my childhood. Those albums were filled with birthday candles, Christmas mornings, backyard barbecues, fishing trips on quiet summer weekends, and a father named Daniel Carter lifting his little boy onto the seat of a bicycle for the very first time. Every scraped knee, every school graduation, every family vacation, every Thanksgiving dinner seemed to prove that blood and love had traveled the same path. Looking back now, I realize those photographs captured something real, but they also hid something no camera could ever reveal. The smiles were genuine. The laughter was genuine. The memories were genuine. Yet somewhere inside those frames was a truth that everyone around me had agreed would never be spoken aloud. There was never a reason to question my family. Daniel worked long hours as an electrician in a quiet Ohio town, often leaving before sunrise and returning home with tired hands and grease still clinging to his work boots. My mother, Rebecca Carter, kept our home together with the kind of quiet strength that made every difficult season seem manageable. We weren't wealthy, but we never felt poor. We had enough food on the table, enough laughter around it, and enough love to believe that nothing could ever break us apart. Neighbors admire my parents. Friends envied the relationship I had with my father. If someone had asked me to describe him, I would have called him my hero without needing a second thought. He taught me to throw a baseball, change a flat tire, respect people, and keep my word even when nobody was watching. If becoming a man meant becoming someone like Daniel Carter, I considered myself incredibly fortunate. Then one ordinary Tuesday evening changed everything. It wasn't a dramatic day. There were no warning signs, no arguments, no strange phone calls, and no feeling that my life was about to turn upside down. After dinner, my phone buzzed while I was sitting alone in my living room. It was a notification from a DNA ancestry service my wife had given me as a Christmas gift months earlier. We had laughed when I mailed the sample, imagining I'd discover some distant Scottish ancestor or perhaps a forgotten branch of Irish heritage. It was supposed to be something fun to share with our children. I picked up my phone without the slightest hint of fear, tapped the notification, and waited for the page to load. For a few seconds, everything felt completely ordinary. Then I reached one sentence that stopped time itself. The man you call Dad is not your biological father. I stared at the screen, convinced I had misunderstood what I was reading. I blinked several times and refreshed the page. The words remained exactly where they had been. I logged out, signed back in, and checked again. Nothing changed. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the television playing in the background. I felt as though every memory I'd ever trusted had suddenly become uncertain. Was this some kind of technical mistake? Had the laboratory mixed up my sample with someone else's? I searched every possible explanation except the one my mind refused to accept. But the more I looked, the clearer the message became. According to the science, according to the records, according to every piece of data in front of me, Daniel Carter, the man who had loved me every single day of my life, was not my biological father. That single sentence destroyed 40 years of memories and uncovered secrets my family had buried for generations. Questions came faster than I could answer them. Why had nobody ever told me? Did my mother know? Did my father know? Was I adopted? Was there some mistake at the hospital? Every possibility seemed impossible, yet every passing second made it harder to believe the life I had always known. Images flashed through my mind as though someone were turning the pages of an old photo album far too quickly. My mother crying alone in the kitchen years earlier when she thought nobody was watching. My father walking out of family gatherings after certain relatives made jokes that I never fully understood. A faded box of old letters hidden high in the attic that my mother once told me never to touch. Medical documents I remembered seeing as a teenager before they mysteriously disappeared. Family photographs that had vanished over the years without anyone explaining why. Memories I had dismissed as meaningless suddenly carried a weight I had never noticed before. I wish I could tell you that the DNA results were wrong, that everything returned to normal after a quick phone call or a simple explanation. I wish I could say that this story ends with a misunderstanding and a happy family laughing together over dinner. But that isn't what happened. The deeper I looked, the more impossible it became to ignore the evidence. Every answer uncovered another question. Every conversation revealed another secret. Every person I trusted seemed to know a different version of the truth. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, in another state, there was a man whose face I had never seen before, yet whose existence would force me to question every chapter of my own life. What began as curiosity became an obsession. What began as a simple family history search became an investigation stretching back more than 4 decades. But the DNA test wasn't the biggest secret. The biggest secret was the reason this truth had remained hidden for so long. Someone had made a choice many years earlier. Someone had decided that an innocent child would grow up believing a carefully protected story instead of the truth. That decision affected every birthday, every holiday, every milestone, every family photograph, and every conversation that followed. By the time I understood what had really happened, I realized this wasn't simply a story about biology. It was a story about sacrifice, fear, guilt, love, and the impossible decisions people sometimes make when they believe they're protecting the ones they care about most. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next would uncover a chain of events that no one in my family ever imagined would finally come to light, and the truth waiting at the end would change far more than my own identity. For most of my life, I believed I'd been given something many people spend their entire lives searching for: a stable family. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, where everyone seemed to know each other by name. Front porches were never empty during the summer. Children rode their bicycles until the streetlights came on, and every Sunday morning looked almost identical. My father, Daniel Carter, would mow the lawn before breakfast while my mother, Rebecca Carter, prepared pancakes that filled the house with a familiar smell I can still remember today. Looking back, those mornings felt ordinary, but after everything I eventually discovered, they became priceless memories. They represented a life built on trust, or at least what I believed was trust. As a child, I never questioned where I belonged. I never questioned who my parents were. Why would I? Daniel was there for every scraped knee, every baseball game, every report card, and every difficult conversation that shaped me into the man I became. If anyone had asked me what made him special, I would have answered without hesitation that he never once made me feel like anything less than a son. Daniel wasn't a man who expressed his emotions with long speeches or dramatic gestures. He believed actions mattered more than words. He worked 6 days a week as an electrician, often leaving home before sunrise and returning after dark with sore hands and tired eyes. Yet no matter how exhausted he was, he always found time for me. If my bicycle chain slipped off, he fixed it. If I struggled with homework, he sat beside me until I understood. When I was 14 and struck out during the biggest baseball game of the season, I expected disappointment. Instead, he placed his hand on my shoulder and reminded me that one bad moment never defines a person's life. Those lessons stayed with me long after baseball became nothing more than an old memory. Daniel taught me integrity, responsibility, patience, and humility. Even today, when I face difficult decisions, I still hear his voice reminding me to do the right thing, even when nobody is watching. That's why what I eventually learned became so difficult to understand. How could someone who wasn't connected to me by blood love me with such unwavering devotion? My mother, Rebecca, was the heart of our home. She remembered every birthday, every school event, every doctor's appointment, and every little detail that made our family feel complete. She had a way of making people feel safe simply by being present. Friends often gathered at our house because they knew there would always be enough food for one more person around the dinner table. She volunteered at church, organized neighborhood events, and somehow managed to remember everyone's favorite dessert. To the outside world, Rebecca and Daniel were the kind of couple people admired. They had been married for decades, rarely argued in public, and always appeared united. If there were problems behind closed doors, they never allowed them to become visible. As our only child, I grew up believing their marriage was the example every relationship should follow. I admired them both without realizing that admiration sometimes prevents us from asking difficult questions. When everything appears perfect, we stop looking for the cracks. There were, however, moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but would later return to my memory with remarkable clarity. During family reunions, distant relatives occasionally made comments that confused me. An older uncle once laughed and said I must have inherited my height from someone else. Everyone around the table fell strangely quiet before quickly changing the subject. Another time, one of my mother's cousins studied my face for several seconds before quietly saying I didn't resemble anyone in the Carter family. My mother immediately smiled, dismissed the comment, and suggested taking another family picture. As a teenager, I thought nothing of it. Families joke with one another. Relatives say strange things all the time. Those moments disappeared into the background of everyday life, buried beneath birthdays, graduations, and holidays. Only years later did I realize those uncomfortable silences weren't accidents. They were carefully managed attempts to avoid a conversation nobody wanted to have. As I grew older, I noticed other differences that seemed easy to explain. Daniel had blue eyes, while mine were dark brown. He was left-handed. I wasn't. He loved repairing engines and restoring old pickup trucks, while I developed a passion for writing and history. Friends occasionally pointed out that we didn't resemble each other very much, but I always laughed it off. People inherit different traits. Genetics are unpredictable. That was enough explanation for me. Even when medical forms asked about family history, I simply repeated what I had always been told. Heart disease on my father's side. Diabetes on my mother's side. Everything fit neatly into the story I'd been given. I had no reason to imagine that some of those answers weren't actually mine to claim. The life I believed belonged to me had been handed down through years of quiet assumptions, and assumptions have an incredible way of feeling like facts when they're never challenged. Life continued exactly as I expected. I graduated from college, married an incredible woman named Emily, built a successful career in commercial construction management, and together we raised two wonderful children. My parents became loving grandparents who rarely missed birthdays or school concerts. Watching Daniel teach my son how to fish reminded me so much of my own childhood that it never crossed my mind anything could be different. He loved those children with the same patience and generosity he had shown me. Rebecca filled their pockets with homemade cookies every time they visited, insisting grandchildren should always leave with full stomachs and happy memories. Our family appeared stronger than ever. If someone had told me then that everything I believed about our family history would soon collapse, I would have laughed. There simply wasn't room in my mind for that possibility. The idea of taking a DNA test didn't come from suspicion or curiosity about hidden relatives. It came from Emily. One Christmas morning, after all the presents had been opened, she handed me a small box wrapped in bright red paper. Inside was a home DNA ancestry kit. She smiled and said it would be fun to discover where my ancestors came from and maybe even connect with distant cousins across the country. It sounded harmless. Millions of Americans were taking these tests, sharing their results online, and learning fascinating stories about their heritage. I imagined finding connections to Ireland, Germany, or Scotland. Maybe I'd discover an ancestor who fought in the Revolutionary War or settled in America generations ago. I certainly didn't expect to uncover something sitting much closer to home. I completed the test without giving it another thought, sealed the sample, dropped it in the mail, and went back to living my normal life. Weeks passed, and I almost forgot about it entirely. Then came that Tuesday evening when my phone buzzed with a simple notification. Your DNA results are ready. I opened the app, expecting an entertaining glimpse into my family's distant past. Instead, I found myself staring at a sentence that made my entire world stand still. I refreshed the screen over and over, convinced there had been some technical error. But the words never changed. According to the results, Daniel Carter, the man who had raised me, sacrificed for me, and loved me every day of my life, was not my biological father. At first, I refused to believe it. Then I felt fear, then confusion, then something even more unsettling. If this wasn't true, the company had made an enormous mistake. But if it was true, then someone I loved had been carrying a secret for more than 40 years. And deep inside, before I spoke to a single person, one thought refused to leave my mind. What if everyone else already knew? I spent the entire night convincing myself the results had to be wrong. Technology fails. Computers make mistakes. Laboratories mix up samples. There had to be a logical explanation because the alternative was simply impossible. I barely slept, and when the sun came up, I was already sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, reading everything I could find about home DNA testing. I searched for stories of false results, laboratory errors, and accidental sample swaps. I found a few isolated cases, but none of them resembled what I was looking at. The science behind these tests had improved dramatically over the years, and while no system is perfect, the odds of receiving a completely incorrect parent-child relationship were incredibly small. That wasn't the answer I wanted. I wasn't searching for the truth anymore. I was searching for permission to ignore it. Every article I read pushed me further away from denial and closer to a reality I wasn't prepared to face. By lunchtime, I had already refreshed my DNA results more than 50 times, hoping the screen would somehow correct itself. It never did. I decided not to tell Emily immediately. She could tell something was wrong the moment she saw my face, but I wasn't ready to explain something I couldn't understand myself. I simply told her work had become stressful and that I needed a little time to sort through a few things. She didn't push me. She knew me well enough to recognize that when I became unusually quiet, I was carrying something heavy. Still, I could feel the guilt growing inside me. Marriage is built on honesty, yet here I was keeping the biggest discovery of my life from the person I trusted most. I hated every minute of it, but I also knew that once I spoke the words out loud, they would become real. As long as they remained trapped inside my own mind, there was still a small part of me clinging to the hope that everything could somehow return to normal. The next morning, I contacted the DNA company's customer support. I explained that the results couldn't possibly be correct and asked whether there was any chance my sample had been mixed up with someone else's. The representative remained calm and professional. She walked me through the testing process, explained the quality controls, and assured me that every sample goes through multiple verification steps before results are released. Then she suggested something I hadn't considered. If I still had doubts, I could purchase another DNA kit through a completely different company and compare the findings. It wasn't the reassurance I had hoped for, but it was enough to give me one final chance to prove the first test wrong. That afternoon, I ordered another kit from a separate company. The waiting began all over again. Every day felt longer than the one before it. Every notification on my phone made my heart race. I wasn't waiting for information anymore. I was waiting for a verdict. 3 weeks later, the second email arrived. My hands trembled before I even opened it. I remember sitting alone in my truck outside the office parking lot because I couldn't bear the thought of reading those results around other people. I took a deep breath, logged into the account, and watched the page slowly load. The words were different this time, but the meaning was exactly the same. Daniel Carter was excluded as my biological father. Two separate companies, two separate tests, the same conclusion. Whatever hope I had been holding on had disappeared in that moment. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and sat there in complete silence. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I felt empty. It was as if someone had quietly removed the ground beneath my feet, leaving me suspended in a life that no longer made sense. I drove home that evening without turning on the radio, barely remembering the route I had taken. The results included another surprise that I couldn't ignore. The website had matched me with several people sharing significant portions of my DNA. One was listed as a first cousin. Another appeared to be a half-aunt. There were names I had never heard before, all connected to me through biology. These weren't distant relatives from centuries ago. These were living people, real people. Some lived only a few hundred miles away. One profile belonged to a man named Michael Hayes, who, according to the estimated relationship, could be my half-brother. I stared at his profile picture for several minutes. We had never met, yet there was something strangely familiar about his face. The shape of his jaw, the color of his eyes. Even his smile reminded me of someone, although I couldn't explain why. I clicked through every available detail, searching for answers hidden inside tiny pieces of information. Instead, I found only more questions. For nearly a week, I avoided my parents. I ignored my mother's cheerful phone calls and politely declined my father's invitation to watch a baseball game together. Every conversation felt impossible because I kept wondering whether they were speaking to me honestly or continuing a secret that had lasted my entire life. I hated myself for thinking that way. Daniel had never given me any reason to doubt his love or his character. Rebecca had devoted her life to our family. Yet every memory now carried a second meaning. Every smile, every hug, every family photograph suddenly felt like part of a story I didn't fully understand. The hardest part wasn't discovering the truth. The hardest part was realizing I no longer knew which memories I could trust. Eventually, the weight became unbearable. I knew there was only one person who could answer the questions that had consumed every waking moment of my life. My mother. I called her and asked if I could stop by the house the following afternoon. She sounded happy, assuming it was just another routine visit. When I arrived, everything looked exactly as it always had. The flowers near the front porch were blooming. The wind chimes Daniel had installed years earlier swayed gently in the breeze. Rebecca welcomed me inside with a warm smile and offered me coffee before noticing that something was terribly wrong. She asked whether Emily and the kids were all right. I nodded quietly. Then I reached into my jacket, removed the printed DNA reports, and placed them carefully on the kitchen table between us. She looked at the papers without touching them. Her smile disappeared almost instantly. I watched the color drain from her face as though she already knew what those documents contained. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have been. Finally, I asked the question that had been trapped inside me since the moment my phone first buzzed with those life-changing results. "Mom, what is this?" She didn't pick up the papers. She didn't deny them. She didn't ask where they came from. Instead, she slowly closed her eyes, took a shaky breath, and whispered 6 words that I will never forget for the rest of my life. "Who else have you told?" In that single moment, every remaining hope vanished. She hadn't questioned the science. She hadn't called it impossible. She hadn't even looked surprised. Her first concern wasn't whether the results were accurate. Her first concern was whether anyone else knew. That was all the confirmation I needed. My mother had been carrying this secret for decades. The question was no longer whether the DNA test was correct. The question had become far more painful. How long had the people I loved been living with the truth while I remained the only one left in the dark? The moment my mother asked, "Who else have you told?" I realized I wasn't sitting across from a woman trying to understand an impossible mistake. I was sitting across from someone who had spent decades hoping this day would never arrive. She remained silent for what felt like an eternity, staring at the papers spread across the kitchen table as though they had somehow appeared there on their own. I didn't interrupt her. I wanted the truth. But I also understood that 43 years of silence couldn't be undone in a matter of seconds. Finally, she reached for the chair beside her and slowly sat down. Her hands trembled as she folded them together. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were already filled with tears. "I always knew this day might come," she whispered. "I just prayed it would happen after I was gone." Those words struck me harder than the DNA results themselves. For the first time since opening that notification on my phone, I knew there had never been a laboratory mistake. The secret had been real all along. I asked her the question that had echoed through my mind every waking hour since that Tuesday evening. If Daniel isn't my biological father, then who is? She lowered her head, struggling to find the courage to answer. Instead of speaking immediately, she stood, walked to the living room, and returned carrying an old wooden box I had never seen before. The edges were worn smooth with age, and the brass latch had begun to tarnish. She placed it gently on the table between us, but didn't open it right away. "I've hidden this for over 40 years, she said quietly. "Every time I thought about throwing it away, I couldn't do it. Every time I thought about telling you, I lost my nerve." She opened the box with shaking hands. Inside were faded photographs, handwritten letters tied together with a blue ribbon, greeting cards, and several black and white pictures of a young man I had never seen before. Yet something about his face stopped me cold. His eyes looked familiar. His smile looked familiar. Without understanding why, I felt as though I were looking into a mirror that had somehow traveled back in time. My mother picked up one of the photographs and held it carefully between her fingers. "His name was Thomas Walker," she said. "Long before I met Daniel, Thomas and I were together." She explained that they had grown up in neighboring towns, fallen deeply in love in their early 20s, and spoken often about getting married. Thomas had enlisted in the United States Army during a difficult period in his life, believing military service would provide stability and a better future. They promised to stay in touch through letters while he completed his training. For months, they wrote to each other almost every week. Then the letters suddenly stopped. Rebecca believed Thomas had decided to move on with his life. She waited, hoping another letter would arrive, but nothing ever came. Weeks became months. Eventually, heartbreak gave way to acceptance. She believed he had abandoned her without explanation. She had no idea that a very different story had been unfolding hundreds of miles away. Several months after losing contact with Thomas, Rebecca met Daniel Carter. He was kind, dependable, and patient in a way she desperately needed after months of emotional pain. Their friendship grew naturally into a relationship, and for the first time in a long while, she felt her life beginning to heal. Then, just as she and Daniel started making plans for the future, she discovered she was pregnant. Rebecca paused as she reached this part of the story, unable to hold back her tears. "I didn't know whose child you were," she admitted. "The timing was so close that there was no way to be certain." She explained that DNA testing simply wasn't available the way it is today. Doctors couldn't provide clear answers, and the only certainty was that a child was on the way. Rebecca told Daniel everything. She expected him to walk away. Instead, he surprised her with a decision that would shape the rest of all our lives. He looked her in the eyes and said, "If we're going to build a family together, then this baby will be my son, no matter what." I struggled to process what I was hearing. Every emotion inside me pulled in a different direction. Part of me admired Daniel even more than before. Another, for days after my mother revealed the truth, I carried the weight of her confession everywhere I went. I wasn't angry with Daniel. If anything, my respect for him had grown beyond anything I thought possible. He had chosen to raise me when he had every opportunity to walk away. He had never once treated me differently. He had never allowed his private pain to become my burden. But there was another question that refused to leave my mind. If my biological father was Thomas Walker, what had happened to him? Had he really abandoned my mother, or had he been living with a completely different version of the story all these years? The only things I had to work with were a handful of faded photographs, several old letters, and a name that had been hidden from me for more than 4 decades. I knew that if I wanted answers, I would have to find the man whose face looked strangely familiar, even though we had never met. The search began with public records, military archives that were available to civilians, old newspaper articles, and countless hours spent comparing information across genealogy websites. I discovered that Thomas Walker had completed his military service, returned to civilian life, and eventually settled in western Pennsylvania. He had worked for nearly 30 years as a high school history teacher before retiring. There was no evidence that he had ever lived in Ohio again after leaving for the Army. The more I learned, the less the story my mother believed made sense. Friends from his hometown described him as dependable, loyal, and deeply committed to the people he cared about. Several former students remembered him as the teacher who stayed after school to help struggling kids prepare for exams. Nothing about the man I was reading about matched the image of someone who would simply disappear without saying goodbye to the woman he loved. The pieces refused to fit together, and with every new discovery, it became harder to believe that Thomas had willingly walked away. Eventually, I found an address connected to his retirement. I must have stared at that piece of paper for nearly an hour before deciding what to do. Part of me wanted to throw it away and pretend none of this had ever happened. Another part knew I would regret it for the rest of my life if I didn't go. I spoke with Emily that evening and finally told her everything. She listened without interrupting, held my hand while I struggled to find the right words, and reminded me that searching for the truth wasn't a betrayal of the father who raised me. "You're not replacing Daniel," she said softly. "You're trying to understand your own story." Her words gave me the courage I needed. 2 days later, I packed a small overnight bag, climbed into my truck before sunrise, and began the 6-hour drive toward Pennsylvania. Every mile felt heavier than the one before it. I rehearsed dozens of conversations in my mind, but none of them sounded right. How do you introduce yourself to a man who may have spent 43 years not knowing you existed? When I finally turned onto the quiet residential street where Thomas lived, I nearly drove past the house. It was modest, with white siding, a neatly trimmed lawn, and an American flag hanging from the front porch. There was nothing remarkable about it. It looked like the home of a retired schoolteacher who enjoyed peaceful afternoons and simple routines. I parked across the street and sat in my truck, watching the front yard while my heart pounded against my ribs. Several times I reached for the door handle, only to stop myself. I wasn't afraid of rejection as much as I was afraid of confirmation. Once I knocked on that door, my life would never return to the way it had been before. After nearly 20 minutes, I finally stepped out, walked slowly up the sidewalk, and rang the doorbell. The man who answered looked older than the photographs in my mother's wooden box, but there was no mistaking the resemblance. His hair had turned gray, deep lines framed his face, and time had softened his features. Yet the moment he looked at me, I felt an uncomfortable sense of familiarity. We shared the same dark brown eyes, the same jawline. Even the way he tilted his head while listening reminded me of my own habits. He smiled politely and asked if he could help me. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Every sentence I had rehearsed disappeared from my mind. Finally, I managed to introduce myself. "My name is Ethan Carter," I said quietly. "I think we need to talk." He invited me inside without hesitation, completely unaware that the next hour would change his understanding of his own life just as dramatically as mine had changed only weeks earlier. We sat across from each other in his living room, surrounded by shelves filled with history books and framed photographs of students, colleagues, and family vacations. I handed him copies of the DNA reports along with one of the old photographs my mother had kept all these years. He studied the papers carefully before picking up the photograph. The color drained from his face. He looked at the picture, then at me, then back at the picture again. His hands began to tremble. After several long moments, he whispered a single name. "Rebecca." It wasn't a question. It was recognition. Tears filled his eyes before he spoke another word. I haven't seen that photograph since I was 23 years old. He leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by emotions he had buried for decades. Then he looked directly at me and asked a question that broke my heart. Are you telling me you're my son? I nodded slowly, unable to speak. The room fell completely silent. Thomas covered his face with both hands and began to cry. They weren't quiet tears. They were the kind that come from years of unanswered questions and opportunities that can never be recovered. When he finally composed himself, he told me a story that neither my mother nor Daniel had ever known. He had never stopped writing to Rebecca. Every week during his military service, he mailed another letter. He proposed marriage in one of them. When none of his letters received a reply, he believed Rebecca had decided to end their relationship. Months later, he returned home and tried to find her, only to learn from someone in town that she had moved away and was preparing to marry another man. Heartbroken and believing she had chosen a different future, he left without trying to interfere in her new life. He never knew she had been pregnant. He never knew I had been born. He never knew that every letter he wrote had mysteriously disappeared before reaching her mailbox. As we continued talking late into the evening, another realization slowly emerged. Neither my mother nor Thomas had abandoned each other. They had both been separated by a lie. Someone had intercepted the letters that could have changed everything. Someone had made certain they would never reconnect. That discovery transformed the entire story. What I had believed was a painful misunderstanding suddenly became something far more deliberate. The question was no longer whether my biological parents had wanted to be together. The question had become far more unsettling. Who had gone to such extraordinary lengths to keep them apart? And what reason could possibly justify stealing an entire lifetime from all of us? That answer was waiting much closer to home than I ever imagined, and uncovering it would force every surviving member of my family to confront a truth they had spent decades trying to bury. The drive back to Ohio was unlike any journey I had ever taken. I had left home searching for one answer and returned carrying dozens of them, yet none of those answers brought peace. Instead, they opened a door to another mystery that reached even deeper into my family's past. Thomas Walker had never abandoned my mother. My mother had never chosen to leave Thomas. They had both spent more than 40 years believing the other had walked away. Somewhere between those handwritten letters and the silence that followed, someone had interfered. Someone had made a decision that altered the course of 3 lives before I was even born. As the miles disappeared beneath my truck, I couldn't stop thinking about those letters. I imagined Thomas sitting in a military barracks late at night, writing to the woman he loved. I imagined my mother waiting by the mailbox every afternoon, wondering why no reply ever came. Neither of them realized they were victims of the same deception. They had lived separate lives because someone else believed they had the right to choose their future. I knew I couldn't let the story end there. A week later, I asked both of my parents if they would meet me at the house where I grew up. Daniel agreed without hesitation. Rebecca sounded nervous, but she knew the conversation could no longer be delayed. I also invited Thomas. It was one of the most uncomfortable phone calls I had ever made. There was a long silence before he quietly accepted. Nobody knew exactly how this meeting would unfold. 3 people connected by one secret were about to sit in the same room for the first time in more than 4 decades. I arrived early and found myself standing in the backyard where Daniel had once taught me to throw a baseball. The old oak tree was still there. The wooden fence looked smaller than I remembered. Time had changed many things, but the memories remained untouched. I wondered how many of those memories had been built alongside heartbreak that I had never noticed as a child. Daniel arrived first. He walked toward me with the same calm expression he had worn throughout most of my life. Before either of us spoke, he placed his hand on my shoulder, just as he had done after every disappointment I experienced growing up. There was comfort in that familiar gesture. A few minutes later, Rebecca stepped inside, her eyes already swollen from crying. Finally, Another car pulled into the driveway. Thomas stepped out slowly, taking a long look at the house before walking toward us. The moment he and Rebecca saw each other, time seemed to stop. They hadn't spoken in more than 40 years. Age had changed their appearance, but recognition came instantly. Neither of them moved for several seconds. Neither of them knew where to begin. Some moments are simply too heavy for words. It was Daniel who finally broke the silence. He walked over to Thomas and extended his hand. Thomas looked surprised before accepting it. "I've wanted to meet you for a very long time," Daniel said quietly. Thomas struggled to respond. "I never knew," he whispered. "I swear to you, I never knew she was carrying our child." Daniel nodded gently. "I believe you." Those 3 words changed the atmosphere in the room. There was no shouting, no acquiescence, no bitterness. Just 3 people carrying decades of pain they had never chosen for themselves. Rebecca began crying again as she apologized to both men. She apologized for keeping the secret from me. She apologized for never searching harder for Thomas. She apologized for allowing fear to guide decisions that affected all of us. Daniel took her hand before she could continue. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore," he told her. As we talked for hours, another family member unexpectedly became part of the conversation. Rebecca's older sister, Margaret, had arrived after receiving my mother's phone call. At first, she insisted she knew nothing about the missing letters. But as details from Thomas's military service and the dates of the letters were discussed, her expression slowly changed. Finally, she lowered her head and admitted something none of us had anticipated. Their late father, my grandfather, had discovered the letters while collecting the family's mail. He believed Thomas's military career made him an unsuitable husband. He wanted Rebecca to marry someone he considered more stable and dependable. Without telling anyone, he intercepted every letter Thomas sent. When Rebecca wrote back, he destroyed those as well. He convinced his daughter that Thomas had abandoned her. When Thomas returned looking for Rebecca, he told him she had moved away and was happily engaged to another man. One man's decision, made in complete secrecy, had rewritten the lives of everyone in that room. The silence that followed Margaret's confession was almost unbearable. Nobody spoke because there was nothing left to say. The truth had finally surfaced, but it came decades too late. My grandfather had passed away years earlier, taking his reasons with him. We would never know whether he believed he was protecting his daughter or simply controlling her future. What mattered was the damage his choice had caused. Thomas lost the chance to raise his son. Rebecca lost the man she believed had abandoned her. Daniel unknowingly stepped into a life built upon a lie, yet still chose to become the father every child dreams of having. And I lost 43 years with a man who never stopped wondering why the woman he loved had disappeared without explanation. There were no winners in this story, only people trying to rebuild what little time remained. When the conversation finally ended, Daniel asked if he could speak to me alone. We walked into the backyard together as the sun began to set. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled the same quiet smile I had known since childhood. "I've been wondering if you're going to ask me something," he said. I looked at him confused. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath before answering. "I thought you might ask whether I still consider you my son." Before I could respond, he continued. "Ethan, I knew the truth before you were born. Your mother told me everything. I made my choice the day I decided to stay. Nobody forced me. Every birthday I celebrated with you, every scraped knee I bandaged, every lesson I taught you, every proud moment I experienced, those were my choices. Blood didn't make those memories. Love did. By then, neither of us could hold back the tears. I embraced the man who had raised me, and in that moment I understood something no DNA test could ever measure. Over the following months, our family slowly began building relationships that should have existed decades earlier. Thomas met Emily and our children for the first time. My kids suddenly had another grandfather who wanted nothing more than to know them. Daniel never saw Thomas as competition, and Thomas never tried to replace Daniel. They spoke often, sometimes over coffee, sometimes during family gatherings. They shared stories about me from different chapters of my life, one from years before I was born, the other from every year that followed. It wasn't the future any of us expected, but it became one we were grateful to have. Healing didn't happen overnight. There were difficult conversations, moments of regret, and years that could never be recovered. But there was also forgiveness. Without forgiveness, the truth would have become just another burden. Looking back now, I often think about that Tuesday evening when my phone buzzed with a notification I almost ignored. If I had decided to open the results another day, my life would eventually have changed anyway. The truth has a remarkable way of finding its way into the light, no matter how carefully it has been hidden. Technology didn't destroy my family. A DNA test didn't break us apart. The deception did that many years earlier. What the DNA test actually accomplished was something very different. It gave every one of us the opportunity to stop living inside someone else's decision. It allowed my mother to lay down a burden she had carried for more than 4 decades. It allowed Thomas to meet the son he never knew he had. It reminded me that fatherhood is measured by sacrifice, loyalty, and unconditional love, not simply by genetics. Today, the old family photographs still sit inside albums on my bookshelf. I look at them differently now, but I don't love them any less. When I see Daniel teaching a little boy to ride his bicycle, I don't see a lie. I see a father keeping a promise he made before that child ever took his first breath. When I think about Thomas, I no longer think about the years we lost. I think about the years we were fortunate enough to find. My identity didn't disappear because of a DNA test. It became complete. I learned that a person can have 2 fathers in 2 very different ways. One gave me life. The other showed me how to live it. So let me leave you with this question. If you discovered tomorrow that the story you've believed about your family wasn't entirely true, would it change who you are? Or would it simply help you understand yourself a little better? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because every family has stories that are passed from one generation to the next, and sometimes the most important ones are the ones that were never told. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to The Story Chamber, where every story reminds us that the truth may stay hidden for years, but when it finally appears, it has the power to change lives forever. Until next time, take care of the people you love, cherish the moments you share, and remember that while DNA can reveal where we come from, it can never fully define who we choose to become. The end.